Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what is unfolding in southern Lebanon right now demands directness, and frankly deserves more than the 3-minute segments that cable news is allocating to it between commercial breaks. Everyone is focused on the ceasefire lines. Everyone is debating whether the IDF withdrawal was orderly or chaotic, whether the casualty figures vindicate the operation or condemn it, whether the diplomatic framework that supposedly ended the fighting will hold for 6 months or 6 weeks. Every mainstream outlet is running the same headlines about UN resolutions and post-conflict reconstruction and the humanitarian situation in the south. But that is not the real story. That is not even close to the real story. The real story is what Hezbollah has been quietly documenting, cataloging, and in several cases physically recovering from the terrain that Israeli forces vacated in their withdrawal from southern Lebanon. I am looking at assessments that have been circulating among European defense analysts and regional intelligence services for the past several weeks. And what those assessments describe is not a defeated organization licking its wounds and counting its losses. What those assessments describe is a military force that emerged from one of the most intense, sustained bombardment campaigns conducted against a non-state actor in modern history with something that nobody in Tel Aviv expected them to have: structural intelligence, positional data, physical assets, and a geographic understanding of the defensive architecture that Israel spent decades building along its northern border that Israeli generals assumed would never fall into enemy hands. I am going to walk you through exactly what Hezbollah recovered, why it matters more than the casualty counts the Western media is obsessing over, and why the phrase that keeps appearing in Israeli security cabinet briefings, according to regional sources, is not victory, it is not deterrence achieved, it is not mission accomplished. It is a single word that the Israeli security establishment finds deeply uncomfortable. Exposure, subscribe now if you are not already subscribed, because what we are about to discuss is being analyzed at the highest levels of multiple governments simultaneously, and you are not hearing it from CNN, from the BBC, from Sky News, or from any of the think tanks in Washington and London that calibrate their outputs to what their government donors are comfortable hearing publicly. Let us start with geography, because you cannot understand what happened without understanding the terrain. The area we are discussing runs approximately 40 kilometers along the Lebanese-Israeli border, from the Mediterranean coast in the west to the Shabah Farms region in the east. This strip of land is not flat. It is not simple. It is not the kind of terrain that satellite imagery captures adequately from altitude. It is a complex, layered network of hills, steep valleys, underground water systems, and limestone karst formations that generations of military planners on both sides have spent decades studying with extraordinary care. The average elevation shifts dramatically over very short horizontal distances. Tunnel construction in this terrain is not just possible, it is practically invisible to surface surveillance under the right conditions. Acoustic signatures get absorbed. Ground-penetrating radar has significant operational limitations in heavily fractured limestone. And it is in precisely this terrain that Israel constructed what multiple Western military analysts have described, without significant exaggeration, as the most sophisticated border defense network in the Middle East. We are talking about dozens of observation posts, underground command facilities hardened against conventional munitions, sensor arrays operating across multiple spectral bands, pre-positioned logistics caches, communication relay stations built directly into the hillsides, designed to blend with natural rock formations, fiber optic communication lines buried at depths intended to defeat detection. The investment was enormous. The operational security around it was treated as a paramount concern. And the assumption underlying all of it was that even if Hezbollah knew roughly where these systems existed, which to some extent they did, they would never have the kind of detailed technical and positional knowledge that would allow them to effectively exploit or counter the infrastructure. That assumption, according to reports circulating among European defense officials and regional security analysts, is no longer operative. According to reporting by multiple regional outlets and confirmed by European defense sources familiar with the Lebanese theater, Hezbollah forces during the period of active Israeli occupation of certain positions and during the withdrawal phase were able to document the precise locations of no fewer than 47 of these installations with a level of detail that goes well beyond general awareness. Not approximately 47 confirmed positions, cataloged, cross-referenced with geographic coordinates, and archived in assessments that have subsequently been reviewed by outside analysts whose conclusions are alarming. That number matters enormously, and I want you to understand exactly why before we go further. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that this level of analysis is not available in the mainstream coverage. Stay with me because what comes next is the core of what Tel Aviv is genuinely worried about. Announcement number 1, the surveillance architecture reversal. And this one matters more than any territorial gain or casualty figure from the recent conflict, because it does not affect the outcome of the last confrontation. It changes the fundamental intelligence equation along the northern border permanently and shapes every future confrontation. When Israeli forces withdrew from positions in southern Lebanon, they did not withdraw cleanly. Let me be precise here, because this is important. This is not an accusation of incompetence or cowardice. It is a logistical reality that every serious military planner in the world acknowledges happens in contested withdrawals under fire. Equipment gets left behind. Documentation gets abandoned in the urgency of tactical redeployment. Digital systems that under normal circumstances would be properly wiped cannot always be fully cleared in active operational timelines when personnel are taking casualties and commanders are making decisions in real time. According to 3 independent regional sources, whose reporting has been consistent and cross-verifiable over the past 18 months, Hezbollah recovery teams documented the partial retrieval of electronic components from at least 11 abandoned IDF observation posts during and immediately following the withdrawal period. These are not trivial components. These are not broken radio handsets or discarded field rations. Defense analysts who have reviewed the descriptions of what was recovered describe sensor calibration data that reveals operating parameters, frequency signatures that map to specific monitoring networks, and, in at least 2 confirmed cases, the physical housings of directional surveillance systems that carry embedded identification codes linking them back to the integrated border monitoring architecture as a whole. One component, properly analyzed by someone who understands the system, becomes a key that unlocks the logic of the broader network. What this means in practical terms is this. Israel spent billions of dollars and decades of operational security constructing a surveillance architecture specifically designed to give them persistent, comprehensive visibility into Hezbollah movements in the terrain north of the border. The entire deterrence framework on the northern front has been built on the assumption of that surveillance advantage. What Hezbollah now possesses, according to these assessments, is the functional equivalent of the blueprint for that architecture. They know where the sensors are, they have significant knowledge of the frequencies those sensors operate on, they understand the geometry of the coverage zones, and therefore the location of the blind spots. And in military intelligence, once your adversary has the map of your surveillance network has been functionally neutralized as a deterrent instrument. You still have the hardware, you no longer have the advantage. Received, that is announcement number 1. Stay with me, because this is precisely where the narrative changes and where the implications for Israeli strategic planning become impossible for honest analysts to dismiss. Announcement number 2. The underground documentation. This is the dimension that Western defense analysts who have been briefed on the situation describe as the most acutely concerning development in the Israeli military's post-conflict assessment. The IDF spent considerable resources, beginning in earnest after 2006, and dramatically accelerating after the discovery of cross-border tunnels in 2018, on what they publicly called the Northern Shield Project. This was an acknowledged program to detect and destroy Hezbollah infiltration tunnels running under the border. Concrete walls were built, detection systems were installed. The program was presented publicly as a success. What was not publicly acknowledged, because doing so would have constituted a significant and potentially catastrophic intelligence disclosure, was the extent to which the Northern Shield construction required Israel to generate extraordinarily detailed documentation of its own underground geography along the entire border strip. Boring machines require precise navigation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys generate comprehensive subsurface maps. Seismic monitoring array installations require geological assessments. All of this work, taken together, produced documentation of the subsurface terrain along the border that is, if you understand its strategic implications, among the most valuable geographic intelligence that exists in that theater. According to reporting by Defense Security Asia, and confirmed by a source with direct knowledge of Lebanese security assessments, Hezbollah engineering units during the conflict period were able to recover physical survey markers, access shaft documentation, and in at least one confirmed instance a complete ground-penetrating radar survey map covering a 14-kilometer section of border terrain. A 14-kilometer section. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The reason this is so profoundly significant is the same reason the United States was severely damaged when certain CIA station locations were inadvertently disclosed in the early 2000s. You cannot unknow a geography. Once Hezbollah's engineers have that survey data in their possession, every future underground construction project they undertake in that zone begins from a foundation of precise geographic knowledge that took Israel years and hundreds of millions of dollars to generate. They did not steal Hezbollah's tunnel plans. Hezbollah recovered Israel's own forensic analysis of the ground beneath the border. The asymmetry of that intelligence outcome is genuinely stunning to anyone who understands how operational security works in practice. Received, that is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3. And this one almost nobody in the mainstream Western media is connecting correctly, because making the connection requires understanding something fundamental about how modern deterrence functions in asymmetric conflicts. Hezbollah did not emerge from this conflict weaker in terms of its intelligence posture regarding Israeli military forces. The bombardment was devastating in human terms, and I want to be unambiguous about that because real families lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, lost their loved ones, and any analysis that treats those losses as mere statistical background noise is not honest analysis. But in terms of Hezbollah's operational understanding of Israeli military infrastructure, unit composition, and deployment patterns along the northern front, the organization emerged from this conflict with a significantly enhanced and more granular picture. Not despite the conflict having occurred, partly because of it. Because the intensity of Israeli operations required the deployment of forces, systems, and command structures whose operational signatures Hezbollah's intelligence apparatus had been patiently monitoring and recording. According to reporting by Al-Akhbar and cross-referenced with European security sources who have reviewed partial assessments of Hezbollah's intelligence holdings, the organization now maintains detailed operational files on no fewer than 23 IDIF units that rotated through southern Lebanon during the conflict period. Unit identifiers, equipment signatures correlated to unit types, rotation schedules and the command logic behind them, communication protocols and the procedural patterns that reveal decision-making structures. This is not speculation from analysts who wish it were true. This is the documented conclusion of intelligence assessments whose contents have reportedly reached at least 2 European capitals through back-channel diplomatic routes, where their reception has been described by sources as sobering. Received, that is announcement number 3. Now let us discuss what is genuinely happening behind the headlines, because 2 simultaneous and very different stories are unfolding in Tel Aviv right now, and the mainstream media is covering only the publicly presentable one. The story they are covering is the story of reconstruction timelines, depleted Hezbollah rocket arsenals, the humanitarian situation in southern Lebanon, the negotiations over UNIFIL deployment parameters, and border demarcation processes. These are real stories. They are not fabricated. But they are the surface narrative, the layer that is safe to discuss in public because it permits the conclusion that the military operation achieved its stated objectives. The story that is not being covered is the one playing out in closed sessions of the Israeli Security Cabinet and in the offices of military intelligence directorate analysts who are working through what the post-conflict intelligence assessment actually shows. Because what the Israeli military and intelligence community is grappling with right now is a question that has no comfortable answer and admits of no political spin. How do you re-establish credible deterrence against an adversary that now understands your surveillance infrastructure, your underground geography, your unit operational patterns, and the blind spots in your border monitoring architecture better than it did before you launched one of the most intensive military campaigns this front has seen? Israeli defense officials have publicly characterized the outcome in terms of Hezbollah organizational degradation. This is accurate in specific measurable dimensions. Hezbollah lost experienced fighters. It lost senior commanders with decades of institutional knowledge. It lost rocket stores that will take years to fully replenish. These losses are real and they matter. But think carefully about what the complete picture represents. When a military organization absorbs those losses and simultaneously achieves a significant improvement in its intelligence posture against its primary adversary, the net effect on the deterrence balance is not straightforwardly favorable for the side that conducted the campaign. A damaged organization with enhanced intelligence capability is a categorically different threat calculation than a damaged organization that is also blind. Israeli planners understand this distinction with perfect clarity. Their public statements do not reflect their private strategic assessments. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and the outcome, every time it repeats, follows a recognizable structural logic. Consider the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta went to war for 27 years. Both sides committed their full strategic resources, their finest military minds, their economic capacity to defeating the other. The conflict reshaped the political and cultural life of the entire Greek world. And when it finally ended, both sides were exhausted, internally fractured, and neither had achieved the decisive and durable strategic outcome they had originally sought. The regional power that emerged in the strongest relative position from that prolonged mutual exhaustion was Macedon under Philip II, a party that had not been centrally involved in the original conflict, but had been carefully observing, learning, and preserving its capacity to act on what it learned. The parallel in Lebanon is structural rather than literal. A smaller, more adaptable organization absorbs severe punishment from a vastly superior conventional military force, while simultaneously extracting intelligence value from every phase of the encounter, then using that accumulated intelligence value to recalibrate its deterrent posture for the next confrontation. This is the defining strategic pattern of successful asymmetric resistance in the modern era. And it is unfolding in southern Lebanon in a form that official narratives on all sides are not capturing with anything approaching honesty. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground in this assessment. Path 1 is the best case from Tel Aviv's perspective. Israeli military and intelligence planners conduct a comprehensive and genuinely honest assessment of the full scope of what Hezbollah recovered, acknowledge the intelligence exposure internally without the political defensiveness that typically accompanies post-conflict reviews, undertake a systematic overhaul of the northern border surveillance and infrastructure architecture, and re-establish a credible deterrent posture within the next 2 years. This path is possible. It requires institutional honesty at a level that is genuinely difficult for any security establishment to achieve in the aftermath of a conflict that was publicly framed as successful. But the professional capacity to execute it exists. Whether the political will to fund and authorize it without public acknowledgement of the underlying problem exists is a separate and more uncertain question. Path 2 is the more probable scenario based on current available evidence. The assessment of what was recovered is conducted, but the most politically uncomfortable conclusions are minimized or compartmentalized at levels that prevent them from driving the resource allocation decisions they would need to drive. Partial upgrades are made to the most obviously compromised systems. The broader architectural vulnerability remains largely unaddressed, and Hezbollah spends the next 2 to 3 years methodically exploiting the intelligence advantage it has accumulated, constructing a more sophisticated understanding of Israeli military capability that becomes the operational foundation for the next confrontation. In this scenario, the next major conflict on the northern front begins from an information asymmetry that significantly complicates Israeli operational planning in ways that previous confrontations in 2006 and more recently did not. Path 3 is the scenario that no capital wants to plan for, and that the structural conditions currently make more plausible than at any previous point in recent years. The strategic recalibration process on both sides is overtaken by events. A miscalculation triggers escalation before either side has completed its post-conflict reorganization. The intelligence advantages Hezbollah accumulated translate into operational consequences in a conflict whose timeline neither side fully controls and whose scope neither side initially intends. The regional and international implications of that scenario extend well beyond the Lebanese-Israeli border. My assessment is that we are positioned between Path 2 and Path 3, with the trajectory moving in a direction that makes continued monitoring of the situation essential for anyone seeking to understand the regional strategic landscape over the next 3 to 5 years. Tell me in the comments what you believe Tel Aviv does next. Tell me whether you think the public Israeli characterization of this conflict matches the private military assessment being made in closed sessions. Tell me if you believe the intelligence posture Hezbollah has now achieved changes the deterrence calculation in ways that extend beyond Lebanon itself to the broader regional balance of power. We track every development along this front and across the regional strategic landscape. That is the purpose of this analysis. Subscribe now. Share this with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is genuinely happening in the Levant beyond the headline numbers and diplomatic press statements. Turn on notifications. The Northern Front is not stable. The intelligence picture is more complex than anything in the mainstream coverage. The implications reach further than Lebanon. We will see you in the next analysis. And before I close, I want to address one more dimension that the analysis requires honesty about. There are voices in the Western commentariat who will argue that Hezbollah's organizational losses are so severe that the intelligence gains I have described are irrelevant to the near-term deterrence equation. That argument deserves engagement rather than dismissal, because it is not made in bad faith by everyone who makes it. The honest response is this. Organizational recovery in the kind of decentralized, ideology-driven structure that Hezbollah represents, historically, happens faster than outside analysts predict and slower than the organization's supporters claim. The Lebanese social and political infrastructure that sustains Hezbollah has not been destroyed. The supply relationships that enable its military reconstitution have not been severed. The political will within the constituency it represents has not been broken. What has changed is the timeline. The intelligence advantages described in this analysis are not going to be operationally decisive in the next 12 months. They become increasingly significant over a 2 to 5 year horizon. And that is precisely the time frame in which the decisions that matter most are being made right now in offices in Tel Aviv, in Beirut, in Tehran, and in Washington. The question is not whether the current balance has shifted. The question is which direction the trajectory of that shift points over the medium term. Based on the evidence available, the answer to that question is not the one that official statements on any side are currently communicating to their publics. The deeper strategic lesson here is one that applies across every asymmetric conflict in the modern era, from Afghanistan to Iraq to the various theaters where conventionally superior forces have encountered determined, adaptive resistance movements. Raw military superiority does not automatically translate into strategic dominance when the adversary is willing and able to learn from every encounter. The accumulation of tactical losses by the weaker party can coexist with strategic learning that ultimately reshapes the balance of advantage. Israel's military establishment understands this. Their planners have studied these dynamics in professional depth. The question, as always in these situations, is whether the institutional and political system surrounding that professional military establishment allows the honest application of that understanding to current policy, or whether the pressure to maintain a narrative of success overrides the strategic necessity of honest assessment. That tension between the requirements of political communication and the requirements of genuine strategic recalibration is the most important dynamic to watch on the Israeli side of this equation over the coming months. Watch for it in budget allocations. Watch for it in personnel decisions within the military and intelligence leadership. Watch for it in the gap between what officials say publicly and what analysts who speak privately are willing to describe. Those indicators will tell you with far more accuracy than any press release which path this situation is actually traveling.